Imagine waking up one morning and finding your entire village gone. Not burned, not flooded, not touched by anything you could name, just empty, doors left open, food still sitting on tables, animals wandering loose in the streets, every single person gone, no bodies, no blood, no goodbye, just silence where there used to be life. This is not a legend. This is not a campfire story someone invented to frighten children. This is what happened on the coast of what is now North Carolina in the year 1590, when English Governor John White returned to the colony he had left behind and found nothing, an abandoned settlement, and a single cryptic word carved into a wooden post. Croatoan, that was it. One word, no explanation, no survivors waiting to tell the tale. White had left 117 men, women, and children behind when he sailed back to England for supplies. He was gone 3 years, longer than intended, because war with Spain had tied up every available ship. When he finally returned, the silence that greeted him must have been something close to unbearable. The shelters were still standing. Personal belongings had been left behind. There were no signs of a violent struggle, no graves, no remains of any kind. An entire community had simply ceased to exist. Some believed the colonists were absorbed into a local Native American tribe, the Croatoan people who lived on a nearby island. One theory suggests they attempted to sail south on their own and were lost at sea. Others point to conflict, starvation, or disease. Archaeological teams have found fragments of English artifacts buried deep inside native sites miles from the original settlement, which gives the absorption theory at least some weight. But nothing has ever been proven, not conclusively, not in 400 years of searching. What makes Roanoke truly unsettling isn't just the disappearance itself. It's the word, because whoever left it behind took the time to carve it carefully into wood. That takes effort. That takes intention. Someone wanted that message to be found. And yet, after more than 4 centuries, we still cannot say with certainty what it meant, where those people went, or whether any of them ever found their way home. Now, across the ocean and across thousands of years, a different kind of silence waits inside a set of ancient walls. And what they found inside those walls changed everything the archaeologists thought they knew. It was 1907 when workers excavating beneath the ruins of the ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro first began pulling away layers of mud brick and compressed earth. And what emerged from the darkness stopped them cold. Dozens of human skeletons, scattered across the streets and alleyways in postures of sudden, violent collapse. Not buried, not arranged. Simply fallen right where they stood, thousands of years ago, as if the end came without warning, without time to run, without time to even cry out. Some of the skeletons showed no signs of battle wounds, no weapon marks on the bones, no evidence of fire or flood damage to explain the sudden mass death of an entire city. They were just people going about their lives, and then nothing. The city of Mohenjo-Daro, one of the most sophisticated urban centers of the ancient world, with its grid-planned streets, its advanced drainage systems, its standardized weights and measures suggesting a level of civic organization we associate with far later civilizations, simply ended. And nobody can explain why. One theory suggests a sudden epidemic swept through the population. Another points to catastrophic flooding from the Indus River. But some researchers, and this is where it gets deeply unsettling, have noted that the skeletal remains in the upper city layers show unusually high levels of radioactivity. Levels that have no natural geological explanation anyone has satisfactorily provided. Let that sit for a moment. And now we go further north, to the edge of the world, to a lighthouse that should never have gone dark. In the winter of 1900, on the remote Flannan Isles off the Scottish coast, a supply vessel approached the lighthouse through brutal, gray Atlantic swells. The crew expected to see movement on the rocks below, perhaps a lantern signal, perhaps the silhouettes of the 3 keepers who had been stationed there. They saw nothing. The lighthouse was dark, and lighthouses are never dark. When investigators finally climbed those cold stone steps and pushed open the heavy door, what waited inside defied every reasonable explanation. 3 men, James Juquet, Thomas Marshall, and an assistant known only as Donald MacArthur, had simply ceased to exist. The table inside the keeper's quarters was set for a meal that was never eaten. 2 of the 3 oilskin coats still hung on their pegs by the door, which meant at least one man had stepped outside without proper protection against what must have been a ferocious winter storm. The log entries are perhaps the most deeply unsettling part. Thomas Marshall, the experienced second keeper, had written entries that read less like professional maritime records and more like the desperate confessions of a man watching his own sanity unravel. He wrote about storms of impossible violence, about the men weeping, about a fear that had no name and no clear source. And then the entries simply stopped, mid-thought, almost mid-sentence, as though whatever came for them came without warning, without sound, without leaving a single trace behind. Some investigators believe a rogue wave struck the men while they worked on the island's western landing, pulling all three into the sea simultaneously. It is a logical theory, clean and comfortable, but it does not explain the sealed door. It does not explain the overturned chair inside, suggesting sudden panic rather than an orderly exit. And it certainly does not explain why a seasoned keeper like James Juket, a man who had survived decades on the open Atlantic, would be described in those final log entries as utterly broken, weeping like a child, consumed by a terror he could not articulate. What did those three men see on that island, in those final hours, before the night swallowed them whole? Somewhere in a vault inside Yale University's rare book library, there sits a manuscript. It is roughly the size of a modest paperback. Its pages are yellowed, its ink faded to a soft brown, and every single word written inside it has defied translation for over a century. The Voynich manuscript, named after the Polish book dealer Wilfrid Voynich, who purchased it in 1912 from an Italian Jesuit college. He immediately recognized that something about this book was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The text flows left to right in neat, confident lines, almost as if the author knew exactly what they were writing. There are paragraph breaks. There are what appear to be chapter divisions. The handwriting is consistent, calm, almost elegant, and yet not a single linguist, cryptographer, or codebreaker in the world has been able to extract a coherent meaning from it. Carbon dating places the parchment itself somewhere between 1404 and 1438, medieval Europe, a time of alchemy, of heretical manuscripts hidden from the church, of secrets guarded with obsessive care. The illustrations inside are perhaps even more unsettling than the text itself. There are drawings of plants that do not correspond to any known species on Earth, roots that spiral in impossible directions, flowers with anatomies that no botanist has ever catalogued. Then come the astronomical diagrams, circular charts filled with tiny human figures, concentric rings, symbols that mirror no known astrological system from that era or any other. And then there is the bathing section. Page after page of naked female figures submerged in elaborate tubular structures, connected by pipes and channels, bathing in what might be water or might be something else entirely. The expressions on these figures are blank, neutral, as if whatever ritual is depicted here is simply routine. Cryptanalysts who cracked enemy codes during the Second World War studied this manuscript and walked away defeated. Intelligence agencies declassified their own attempts to decode it from the 1940s, and those attempts failed completely. Some of the finest mathematical minds of the 20th century applied statistical analysis to the letter frequency patterns and found something genuinely strange. The text behaves like a real language. It has internal grammar. It has word repetition patterns consistent with natural speech. It is not random noise, but it is also not anything anyone has ever spoken or written before. One theory suggests it was created by a medieval genius as an elaborate hoax, an entire constructed language built purely to deceive. But here is the problem with that theory. Constructing a false language convincing enough to fool modern computational analysis would be an extraordinary feat even today. Doing it in the 15th century would border on the impossible. Another theory, quieter and stranger, suggests the manuscript is genuine, a real record of real knowledge, but knowledge that belongs to a tradition so thoroughly erased from history that we have lost every single key needed to open it. A language, a system of thought, perhaps even a worldview, simply gone. And somewhere beneath all of that is a possibility that no serious academic will say out loud, but that lingers in the back of every mind that has spent time with these pages. What if the manuscript is not in code at all? What if it is written in a language that was never meant for us? And yet the most unsettling evidence of all isn't found in written records or buried beneath layers of sediment. It's carved directly into the rock, out in the open, where anyone can see it, and where no one has ever managed to explain it. Across every inhabited continent on Earth, ancient cultures left behind marks in stone that simply should not exist given what we believe we know about them. Not scratches, not crude symbols. Precise, deliberate, deeply cut geometries that required sustained effort, specialized knowledge, and in some cases tools we cannot identify. On the Nazca Plateau of Peru, lines stretch for kilometers across the desert floor with an accuracy that remains startling even when measured with modern instruments. Some form animals, some form spirals, some are nothing but perfectly straight corridors cutting through the landscape for miles, deviating by fractions of a degree. The Nazca people, by all conventional accounts, had no wheels, no written mathematics, no surveying technology. And yet the lines exist, and the lines are flawless. One theory suggests they were ceremonial paths, walked rather than viewed. Another proposes they aligned with astronomical events. But here is what no theory fully accounts for: the sheer scale and the obsessive, almost inhuman precision of the execution. And Nazca is not alone, not even close. And every single one of those ancient marks pointed in the same direction. Now consider this. The survivors, fishermen from nearby villages, a handful of hunters who had been working the forests that morning, a woman tending her garden on the eastern ridge, none of them had coordinated their stories. They had no way to. Communication between those remote settlements was slow, sometimes taking days. And yet when investigators finally gathered their accounts weeks later, the consistency was staggering. Almost everyone described a column of bluish-white light descending at a steep angle from the northwest. Not a fireball arcing across the sky the way meteors do. Not a horizontal streak. Something coming down deliberately, at an angle that one witness described as, and I am quoting directly here, like a sword being driven into the earth. One hunter, whose testimony was recorded and preserved in regional archives, said the light was accompanied by a sound he could only compare to fabric tearing, but magnified to a scale that seemed to involve the sky itself. He said the trees around him began to sway before the main blast arrived, as if something invisible had passed through the air first. A pressure wave, or something else entirely. The woman on the eastern ridge reported that her dog refused to move for nearly an hour afterward. Just sat facing northwest, trembling, ears flat. What were they all describing? Scientists who later studied the Tunguska event collected over 200 witness testimonies. And while the accounts vary in small details, as human memory always does, the directional consistency is almost impossible to dismiss. Something came from the northwest. Something the sky itself seemed to announce before it arrived. And to this day, no recovered fragment, no confirmed crater, no physical object has ever been pulled from that Siberian ground to tell us exactly what it was. But here is where the story takes a turn that most people never hear about. Because buried inside the official reports, tucked beneath layers of bureaucratic language and half-finished conclusions, there is one detail. One single, quiet detail that, once you notice it, makes everything else collapse like a house of cards. The stones were not just arranged. They were arranged in a pattern that matched no known cultural tradition from that region. Every anthropologist who examined the site independently reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. The spacing, the orientation, the deliberate asymmetry, it bore no resemblance to anything built by the peoples who supposedly inhabited that land for thousands of years. Not even close. And yet the dating was undeniable. The material had been placed there during a period when, according to every historical record we possess, no organized civilization capable of such precision existed anywhere nearby. Not within hundreds of miles. Some researchers have quietly suggested that we are not dealing with a local tradition at all. That whatever, or whoever, created this either traveled an almost impossible distance, or belonged to a chapter of history we simply have not written yet. One theory, cautiously proposed by a small number of archaeologists, suggests the site represents contact between two groups whose meeting we have no record of. A crossing of paths that left only this, cold stone and silence, as proof it ever happened. And that is the part that should keep you awake tonight, not the mystery itself, but how close we came to never asking the question at all. And yet, perhaps the most unsettling question is not what happened to those who came before, but what remains. What still lives in the valley? Because the reports did not stop with the ancient chronicles. They continued into the 20th century, into living memory. Shepherds working the high pastures along the valley's eastern ridge described hearing sounds at night that no known animal produces. A low, resonant humming that seemed to rise from the earth itself, not from any creature moving through the grass. Geologists who surveyed the region in the 1970s noted unusual electromagnetic readings near the old stone formations, readings that their instruments could not explain and that their reports quietly buried in footnotes nobody read. One theory suggests the valley sits above a vast network of underground caverns, and that what people hear, what they feel in their bones when they stand too close to the old stones, is simply the earth breathing through hollow places beneath their feet. It is a rational explanation. It is almost convincing. But then there are the lights. Witnessed independently, across generations, across cultures with no contact with one another. A cold, bluish glow hovering above the valley floor on moonless nights, documented by travelers, by monks, by soldiers passing through during wartime who had absolutely no reason to invent stories. Some things persist. Some places hold onto something we do not have a name for yet. The valley is still there. The stones are still standing. And on certain nights, those who live closest to it still do not go outside. Whatever it is, it never left.